The movies have been the most dominant entertainment vehicle for the past 100 years. The ability to tell a story with the dynamic tools available has just become incredible. But their ability to tell a story has always been incredible, right from the time of talking pictures. I've been fascinated by this creativity, this ability to tell a story, ever since I was in school. At the university, I studied English literature, and I minored in film studies. So I've always thought about storytelling. I've always wondered about how incredible it is, how unique it is to our species. As I watched more movies and saw what the medium can do with the interplay of music and image, the written word, the spoken word, of course, I became more fascinated by the ability to create something out of nothing. The cliche is the blank page when I was younger in the typewriter, or the blank screen now on a computer. There's nothing, and then there's something. So, as a species, as I said, are we the only ones who are creative now? Until such time as we figure out what the whales and the dolphins are saying to each other, we'll have to assume that we are the only species that pauses our lives, steps back from them, looks at them, analyzes them, and decides to comment on them, either with some philosophical interjections or by storytelling. And I've often wondered, at some point there was no storytelling at all. And then there was. So once upon a time, if we can imagine, several thousand years ago, a couple of hunter-gatherers go back into the cave after a tough day's work. They have their kill, they eat their kill, which is what they did every day. And then afterwards, one says to the other, "So what do you want to do tonight? Same as usual?" And the other one might have said, "I've had this urge for the last little while to take some of that wildebeest blood, mix it with the clay of the cave, and paint a picture on the wall of the cave." The other person looks at him and says, "That sounds like the dumbest thing I've ever heard." And the other one says, "Well, out there today when you leapt up and jabbed that spear into the wildebeest with the sunset in the background and the wind blowing the savanna back and forth, I thought it was a spectacular image, and I want to put that image up on the wall." To which the other one says, "So you're saying I'm the focal point of this picture?" And the other one says, "Yes, as a matter of fact, you will be." To which he says, "Well, you know what? This idea is starting to make a whole lot more sense all of a sudden." And at that point, the desire to contemplate, to analyze, to think about our daily lives began. I mean, of course, it's just my imagination and how I thought it might have happened. Maybe there was a spillage of something and somebody said, "Look at the wall, that looks like a tree that's up there." Somehow, our species decided to comment on our daily existence rather than just day in, day out do the same thing for thousands of years. Now, I don't know how long this lasted. I don't know if every cave had its resident painter, if a group of caves had one painter for a group. I don't know if this cave painted lasting for hundreds of years or thousands of years. I know that archaeologists have found these cave paintings all over the world, but it seems like it was a beginning. And from that beginning, whether it died out, whether it was a fad, I don't know, storytelling had begun. And so we have to move forward to about 3000 BCE, before the Common Era, according to scholars, when civilization emerged, which means that in Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, cities became a thing, and these cities became big enough to become kingdoms, and of course they grew. Kingdoms have rulers, and rulers, like throughout history, like to have buildings, statues, monuments erected to them, and so that is a form of a primitive, basic, but very important form of creativity. And these buildings were built. The pyramids, the Sphinx, temples. There were buildings made to the gods they worshipped, like the temples. And of course, it was in the ruler's interest to connect their buildings to the temples so that they could prove that they were descendants of these gods and perpetuate their rule. So this was around 3000 BCE. And of course, what happened in Egypt remains today. There are temples with all kinds of writing on the walls. The pyramids just even of themselves are a statement to something. The notion that these civilizations would last forever, and even though they didn't, the pyramids certainly have lasted forever. But again, an enhanced form of storytelling. We're telling the story of our time, of our ruler, of our gods. We're talking about the great battles he won, etc., 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 or she won, etc., etc., etc. Then, around 1200 BCE, and there had been wars, probably wars for 1,000 years. These kingdoms, nobody seemed to be able to get along, as if today is much different, but there was a tremendous war around 1200 BCE. Great war, two huge nations. It had everything. It had heroes and villains. It had a leading lady. It had love, lust, revenge, and of course a lot of violence. And one of these nations was utterly destroyed. That could have been the end of it, but according to scholars, about 300 or 400 years later, someone by the name of Homer wrote about this war. Now there's debate about whether Homer was one person or whether there were several contributors to this story, whether it was an oral tradition for a long, long time and then not written down, or whether it was written down. Let's say that it's Homer, one person, and he wrote this story. It's the story of the Trojan War, of heroes like Achilles and Hector and kings that were vengeful, and violence was unbelievable. And the biggest blonde bombshell in all of history, Helen of Troy, was the star of the show. And then there were gods and goddesses who clearly had behavioral issues that hadn't been dealt with yet, such that Troy ceased to exist and the other nations, Mycenae and others, survived. So the story, there's a two-part story, a tremendous story that has lasted for 3,000 years, the story of the Trojan War. The Iliad, which is the first book of the Trojan War, about the actual battle, and then the Odyssey, in which another of the heroes of this war, Odysseus, has a heck of a time going home and spends a whole lot of time all over the Mediterranean trying to get back home. The story has come down through the ages. Probably everyone who's ever taken pen or whatever, quill to paper, has read the story or knew of the story. And it really was, I think, the birth of this creativity, creative energy, this art of storytelling that has lasted to our time. If we jump ahead from about 800 BCE to 600 BCE, we arrive at the glorious moment of Ionia in Greece, which is a period in time where philosophy, medicine, sculpture, poetry, perhaps painting, architecture, reached a level that was virtually unsurpassed for 2,000 years. And of course, they had their share of incredible people, the heroes of the time, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and the playwrights, Aristophanes, Euripides, Sophocles, and many, many, many more, most of whom's works are lost to us, but for some incredible miracle, enough of them have survived that we do have a record of the ancient world. My favorite word for them is antiquity. That antiquity has survived somehow, but this period of the 6th century and part of the 5th century BCE was a remarkable period in time when everything seemed to progress. Now, a couple hundred years later, this fellow Alexander made his mark, to be sure, and after conquering the known world, he went to Egypt, which was one of his favorite places, and he built a city out of nothing, Alexandria. And this city contained a library. And even though this library was huge, and then it was destroyed, and it was huge again and destroyed, It eventually survived until about the 5th century CE, the Common Era. And in that 5th century, it had reached a point where whoever the curators were, anything and everything that had been written in the ancient world, philosophy, plays, poetry, dissertations, they got copies or originals of everything and stored them in this library quite famously. And sometimes they just took things that they wanted, and it was the repository of all the knowledge of the known world up until that time. Unfortunately, the last curator of this library, well, not unfortunately, but the last and perhaps the greatest, was this woman called Hypatia. She was the curator, and she was carrying on the traditions of the library, and Alexandria became the go-to place for scholars to study, to debate, for all this knowledge to really flourish. And then she was murdered, and the library was burnt down, and very little survived. Enough survived, of course, so that we now in the modern age know about antiquity, but a lot of it was destroyed. And that was near the end of the 5th century CE. So according to scholars, this was of course the end of the Roman Empire at the same time, and 200 years of what scholars called the Dark Ages fell upon Western Europe, where nothing was built, very little was written, nothing was painted. There was no architecture. The barbarians who had run over all of the Roman world were not interested in making cities or anything. They were just nomadic. But the few survivors who kept going west and west and west until they ran out of room to go and ended up in a bunch of islands off the west coast of Europe and England in the Atlantic held on to what they knew. The manuscripts, somehow through Arab hands that had been translated, somehow made their way to, after a couple hundred centuries, into monasteries, so that the glory of this period was somehow preserved. As Kenneth Clark says in this tremendous show called Civilization, he says Western Europe got through by the skin of its teeth because the entire civilization of the ancient world could have been completely obliterated and never heard from again. But then, by about the 11th century, civilization had rebuilt itself and was starting to form into something that resembled cities, countries, and of course, scholarship. And it began with architecture when these massive cathedrals were built out of nothing, or came out of nowhere, but this energy, again, this creative energy, the actors at the time were larger than life, their writings have come down to us. The buildings, for most of them, are still exist. Canterbury, Chartres, Durham Cathedral, all these places are still standing. And civilization started to take on a shape that was once again permanent as it could be. Well, this went on for a few hundred years. The Middle Ages, in the Western world, the English literature began to flourish with Chaucer, Italian literature, Dante. But then around the end of the 15th century, the beginning of the 16th century, in Rome, there was such a power, the church was so powerful, and not necessarily from a spiritual standpoint, but it was a power full of very educated people, men, of course, because it was a men-only club. And they wanted to being in Rome, they wanted the church to be bigger than and better than the ruins they saw around them, the Colosseum and many other buildings that were still extant. So somehow these people discovered or rediscovered the writings of the ancient world. And these people became the heroes of this period. Pope Leo, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Bramante, the architect. And so this period was known as the Renaissance, which was a rebirth of the great epic of ancient Greece and Rome. And of course, they wanted to equal and surpass it. And if you think about Da Vinci and his paintings, and of course his notebooks, which are fascinating, Michelangelo with the sculpture David, the paintings of the Sistine Chapel, Raphael painting the apartments in the Vatican, it was a real enormous leap forward in terms of creativity. And of course, again, as I say, this is an act of telling a story of our time, how we are, what it was like in the ancient world and what it's like today, and how we as this Catholic world, this Christian world, the paintings and sculptures are a homage to their faith and the world they were living in. So by the beginning of the 16th century, the leap forward was extraordinary. Then about 75 years later, in England, the literature of the Elizabethan era was once again took a tremendous leap forward. Many tremendous authors, of whom the one we know the most is Shakespeare, which really is, despite what the debate is, we can recognize these writings. We can read the plays of Shakespeare and say, hey, yeah, I get that. That's love and hate and jealousy and murder and mayhem. But we can relate to those stories. They are stories that are describe the emotions and feelings of our modern times. And fortunately, Shakespeare has still survived to this day. The music of his language, the incredible genius that is Shakespeare. But it really, again, advanced this whole storytelling thing that I'm concerned about. The 16th and the 17th and 18th century music and some literature, and of course more architecture improved. The 19th century saw, again, more strides in music, incredible music. But then also in the Victorian era, the novel became even more famous. It started in the 18th century, but exploded. The chief among all the terrific writers of that period was probably Dickens, Charles Dickens. So that by the late 19th century, storytelling was starting to reach a level that had never reached ever. And at the same time, in that the end of the 19th century, we had the photograph had been around for about 30 years. The telegraph existed. The telephone was invented. And then in the late 1880s in France, these pictures, somebody decided, why can't we just take moving pictures? And the Lumiere brothers were the first to invent a camera that captured on some sort of film stock moving pictures. And that is, there's a lot of documentaries and books written about the dawn of the motion picture business and film. But it began more or less in France in the late 1880s, 1890s. And at that time, of course, there was also, by 1900, there was the motor car had been invented, and the flying machine, the heavier than air machine that could fly in 1903. And by 1910, 1911, planes weren't everywhere, but they were much more sophisticated than the original version in 1903. So in the early 1900s, Europe had very sophisticated films. They were doing stage plays on film. There was no sound, but they were sophisticated, and their special effects that they used with tricks with the camera were quite sophisticated. In the US, much less so. There's lots of debate as to why the film industry in the US started so slowly. Some say that because Edison had obtained the patents and the copyrights to the cameras and film stock and other things, that the industry didn't evolve as quickly as it did in Europe. But then around 1910, 1911, 1912, it started to pick up in the US. At first, people would go to a place, put a nickel in a machine and watch 2 minutes or 1 minute of a movie, and then put another nickel in and watch it, the similar one or the same one again and again. That was the Nickelodeons, what they called those machines. But clearly the demand for this was increasing by leaps and bounds, and the people who were making these films and the people who were able to put money into this industry saw that there was a potential here for much more. Then two things happened around 1912, 1913, 1914. First thing that happened was what was then called the Great War, the catastrophe that was the First World War in 1914, that pretty much obliterated the film industries of France and Germany, and to some extent England, to some extent Italy, because their whole nations were consumed by the war and ravaged by the war. So the advantage that Europe had over North American film production dissolved. which meant that there was still a demand, but out west, I mean in the West, in the United States, they saw that there was an opportunity here to really expand what they were doing. So on the US side, there were two things. There was a pioneer by the name of D.W. Griffith, who wanted to make more than 3-minute, 5-minute, 10-minute movies. He wanted to make full-length movies. And by 1914-15, he made a 2-hour, 3-hour film that changed everything. That was the first cataclysmic change. The second one was that for reasons of weather, for reasons of location, for reasons of flexibility, the film business, which initially was on the east coast of the US, ended up in California in a place called Hollywood. And so by 1914, 15, 16, an overwhelming percentage of movies made in the world were made in Hollywood, and they were transmitted all over the world because Europe was unable to create those films. So they had the demand, and they had pioneers who really took movies to the next level, and this exploded. Now, the funny thing about this is that movies were silent. And what was the advantage to this? A silent film can be seen anywhere in the world because there's no language. Now, there are title cards. When people said, "Hey, how are you?" the title card would say, "Hey, how are you?" But those title cards could be changed in the films to any language you wanted. So those films had a worldwide audience, which helped to make the industry explode. And the second thing was the pioneers like D.W. Griffith, and then an Englishman about 26 years of age, an orphan who had been raised in British vaudeville. Vaudeville was not stage plays, but comedies, dancing, music, tricks, in front of a live audience, where he got his training. And he ended up in Hollywood, and eventually he got into the film business. And in 1916, this individual, whose name is Charlie Chaplin, was paid $875,000 in 1916 to make 12 movies. Now, in 1916, there was no federal tax in the U.S. So that was, even today, it seems, an extraordinary amount of money. In later years, he would be given or paid even more than that to make movies. And so between Griffith and his films, Birth of a Nation, which is a very controversial film, but Intolerance, and the techniques he perfected or invented or refined to make the storytelling of movies take a great leap forward, and then the genius of Chaplin to make people all over the world laugh and cry. The silent era was the golden age, the start of films. Now, I think the silent era is tough for new viewers of movies because it is very removed from what we've been watching since the early 30s. They reached a level of technical skill, sophistication, and brilliance, which is unbelievable when you start to watch the best of the silent era, also known as the pantomime era. And the other thing that if you look at these things, it wasn't really silent. Now, the film stock had no sound on it, there's no question. But the theaters became palaces where going to a movie was an event. And what happened was that there would be at least, if not an orchestra in the movie theater, there would be 3 or 4 musicians, a pianist, maybe someone playing an organ, maybe strings, so that there was always sound connected with the movie, but it wasn't on the film stock. So the silent film era was actually not all that silent, except there was no sound on the film, but the movie-going experience was full of sound. The reality was, though, however, that the silent era was born to die. However much people loved the silent films, and they loved them all over the world, there was an urge for there to be sound. And as early as the 1920s, there was sound on film, and the technology was advancing rapidly, so that the day of a talking picture, as they used to call it, was coming. Even though silent films flourished, were incredibly successful, the stars of that era made fortunes beyond which we can possibly imagine. And in fact, Charlie Chaplin was, for probably 10 years, the most famous person in the world. However, in the 20s, radio was invented. so that people could listen to somebody talking. Now, they couldn't see them, but they could hear them. And radio was an enormous success. And radio was a threat to the movie business because there was nobody talking in the movies. So the movies had to weather that storm of the invention of radio, which they more or less did, but they had to fight for their audience. However, and it suggested to the technicians who were working in sound that it was their time to really push this experiment forward, such that by 1927, a movie was made that had not too much talking in it. It was mostly silent, but there was a little bit of talking and there was singing on the film stock. And so that movie premiered, and it was called The Jazz Singer, and the star was Al Jolson, and it changed movies to forever to where we know them today, because the audiences just wanted sound. So the first movie was a tremendous success, The Jazz Singer. But some people in the industry thought, well, you know what, maybe it's a fad, maybe it's going to go away, we're not sure yet. And plus, they feared losing the institutions that ran the movie business. There was 5 or 6 studios, feared losing their audience because an English-speaking movie was not going to sell in France or Germany or Russia or any foreign country because people didn't understand the language. So that's what made that advent into sound a little slower. However, the writing was on the wall, as they say, not the cave wall. And the next sound film, where there's a little bit more sound, not a lot, was again a complete success. And by that point, by 1928-29, it was all over. Even though the theater owners hated the fact that they had to now spend a lot of money to add sound to their theaters because the projectors had a sound system, and so there's lots of expense, and the transition was anything but easy, but sound was here to stay. And the silent cinema, by the 1929, maybe only 2 films after 1930 were silent, made by, no surprise, Charlie Chaplin, who still managed to have tremendous success because of the genius he was. But the silent era, the romance of movie making, as Douglas Fairbanks had said, is over. And the world of talking pictures, or talkies as they called them, began. Now, the transition was really difficult because the microphones were not technically superior to anything like what they are today, or even close. They were clunky, such that the movie makers had to almost start from scratch in movie making. The movies, the end of the silent era, the movies had cameras moving like crazy and enormous vistas and sets that were unbelievable and huge. And now they had to gear everything they made to a microphone. So the actors were stuck and didn't move much, and they had to wonder where the microphone was. The cameras themselves made a lot of noise, so they had to put the camera inside a booth that would get very hot. It didn't move very much. So the early films, the early talkie films, by and large are still to this day are very difficult to watch. They're just so primitive, but it was a start. And the amazing thing to me is that between 1932 to 1939, 7, let's say 8 years maybe, the advances made in talking pictures were exponential. Somehow they figured it out really fast. And what happened in the early 30s was, what are we going to make in these talking pictures? We don't want to have people standing around talking. That lasted for a few pictures. Everybody thought that was cool. But then the novelty wore off. So one of the things that began in the 30s was the musical. People up on the silver screen, because there was all black and white, of course, was singing and dancing. Stories, yes, but a lot of singing and a lot of dancing and a lot of people singing and a lot of people dancing. And the musical of Hollywood was born in the early 30s and was very, very popular. But by the middle, late 30s, the storytelling, the sophistication of the stories, again, was growing exponentially, such that the year 1939 has been considered by film scholars as being one of the best ever, with the quality of movie that came out, the sophistication of the technology. I'll only mention 2 movies of that year. There were many movies that year that came out that were exceptional. The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind. And we'll talk about those movies sometime, but they are still watched today as regularly as anything. So the 30s was the rebirth of movies, the talking pictures, the musicals, the storytelling. Storytelling little by little became more sophisticated and more successful. But again, by the end of the 30s, the early 40s, there was another catastrophe in Europe, and that was the Second World War, which actually began in 1939, but became a world war by 1941 and lasted till 1945. This didn't slow down movie making too much, because movies were made right through the war, but it did sort of signal the end of the period of the 30-ish movie making. And then post-war. Post-war became the movies that came out after the war were grittier. The era was known as the film noir era, where tough movies with lots of tough men and women and harder stories, life being depicted as being really difficult and not cheery and fun as the 30s were, but still great movies produced in this time period. Then by the time the 50s came around was I think the highest point for the movie musical in the 50s. Many fabulous films. I love these movies, with Technicolor now being used much more often, even though the majority of films were still black and white. There was Technicolor movies. The talent of the stars of that era was just unbelievable. Hollywood being the magnet for anybody or everyone and anyone who thought they might be able to dance, to sing, who looked pretty. Would flock to Hollywood, and I know there's documentaries and books on books written about the horrors of the Hollywood era, but also its greatness. So the 50s were really another time of growth in movie making, but at the same time, near the late part of the 50s, the studio system, these 6 or 7 or 8 houses of studio makers that had existed since the early 20s, for some reason they were running out of gas. The independence of the actors, perhaps the fact that the same men who had run these studios for 30 years were dying, and their replacements were not of the same caliber, perhaps, or there was just a shift in who was in charge. Were they accountants? Were they people much more interested in the bottom line? Even though the moguls, as they were called, of the studio period were no different than anyone else. They wanted to make a buck. There was also a love of movies, as many of the scholars have said, in these people, but it changed, such that by the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s, the rebellious 60s, the studios were dying out, and much more independent film, much more star-based film. The directors were the stars in the movies of the 60s, such that today when we look at movies from the late 50s and the 60s, most movie lovers see films that they can really relate to, like, well, they look like today's films, sort of, kind of. Many more were in color, a lot fewer in black and white, such that by the 70s, virtually all the black and white films were done. It was all color. And so that was really the modern era of film, would have been beginning in the 60s and then 70s, 80s, and 90s. So for me, there's 2 eras of filmmaking. The silent pantomime era from about 1910 to 1928, 29, and then the transition period to the talkies of the early 30s. It probably started in 1930, but very hard to watch many of those films. But from 32 on, 33 on, was the birth of the talking pictures and movies that we recognize now, that we can watch. I think watch any movie from that period, from the 30s up to the present, relate to them. We don't know the actors, we don't know the stars, we don't know their backgrounds or their histories. But for me, these were fabulous films. And these were the movies I grew up watching. Much later, these are the movies. Many of my favorite films all of my favorite films are definitely between 1932 and 2000, 1995 to 2000. All of my favorite films are in this period. And that's the area I want to focus on, to talk about this incredible storytelling medium that is unlike any other in recorded history. The the technical sophistication and almost perfection of putting music, words, and images together to entertain, to tell a story, to enlighten, all the things that movies do, is really the focus of what I want to talk about. And at least that's how I see it from the 22nd row.